I think about growth at all costs. You can sell your way to 100 units, to 200 units, to 300 units through optimism and great sales process. What you can't as easily sell your way past is, are your franchisees profitable? Does your business model work? Does it work at scale?
You're listening to RevOps Champions, a podcast created for B2B leaders to help you align your people, streamline your processes, trust your data, and leverage technology in order to grow your business. Hello and welcome back. Today, I'm joined by McElroy, founder and CEO of Kaleidoscope Growth Advisors, a franchise advisory firm focused on helping emerging and growth stage brands build scalable, sustainable franchise systems. Ali is a recognized franchise industry leader with nearly 2 decades of experience spanning franchising, international expansion, operations, legal strategy, and organizational growth. Before founding Kaleidoscope, she held executive leadership roles at Lyft brands, including serving as president, international, and chief legal officer, where she helped support franchise expansion across multiple brands and global markets. In addition to her advisory work, Ali serves on boards, mentors founders and operators, and is widely recognized within the franchise industry for her leadership and contributions to franchise growth and development. She's a certified franchise executive, CFE, and has been recognized among Global Franchise Magazine's 100 influential women in franchising. Ali, welcome to the RevOps Champions podcast.
Thank you, Brendan. Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. And it was so weird when we were first connected to find out that we're practically neighbors. We live like a couple of 100 yards apart, which is kind of nuts, right?
It is pretty nuts. I always talk about franchising as such a small community, even globally, but I think this might be when we talk about franchise.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
Really funny. Well, good to see you. So, Ali, you've helped franchise brands scale across international markets. What separates companies that scale sustainably from those that struggle as complexity increases?
Well, that's such a good question. And I wish there was one magic solution we could give to everybody. But I think there are some common lessons and threads that you can see when you look at what does it take to build that strong, sustainable franchise system. And I think it starts with a few, those few common concepts. That one being just really a commitment to understanding not just your goal, but your purpose in being a franchisor and in the brand's purpose and the brand's mission and vision and values, and building a culture of the organization around that greater purpose. I think that's one really important foundational concept. A second foundational concept that I've experienced in looking at both the ability to scale and the sustainability then of what you've built is really focusing on franchisee unit level economics. And it's such an easy soundbite to say. We all know the answer, but what truly separates the exceptional are those who really embrace that idea in the day-to-day operating and dive into that on a really deep level. And I think the third piece is when you're looking at growing a franchise system, and especially starting in franchising or in the early days and emerging, whether that's starting your franchising at all or bringing to a new country or a new market, is really taking the time to lay the foundation and do your homework in advance. And that idea of a little bit of let's go slow to go fast. Growth and building foundation aren't necessarily opposite concepts. Although sometimes they can feel like it, but really taking the time to set a strong foundation that you can then grow from, and try and avoid that challenge where if you have some challenges in your business, they're exponential at scale. Scale doesn't solve the problems, in my experience.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that is very congruent with what we typically hear and talk about from people who've seen both successful scale in franchising and those who've seen the brands that sort of stall out, whether it's before they even get to 10 units or when they get to 30 units. I've had a few people sort of talk about this death zone between 30 and 40 units that so many brands get to, and they don't understand why they cannot get past that stage. And I think, to your point, a lot of it probably comes down to something related to, you started talking about culture being so important. And I think what culture is so closely linked to is leadership. right? And
Mm.
and as we talk about here all the time, so revenue operations, which of course we call RevOps, the model that we use at Dynamico is it's people, process, data, and technology. And what's interesting about what you're saying, and I'd like to hear more from you on this. So when a brand reaches out to us, they're typically reaching out to us because they think that the problem is a technology problem where they've sort of outgrown their systems, right? Their CRM, whatever's driving their revenue, they've outgrown it. And part of our job of being able to build them the system that's going to help them scale is we need to make sure that they are aligned on the people front, which includes leadership, culture, and knowing that they have the right people that are going to be able to drive that scale. And then, of course, knowing that their processes need to evolve as they go from 10 units to 30 units to 100 units to 300 units, et cetera. We call it the rule of threes and tens. And it, so you talk about unit level economics, which is part of the data component. We need to know what the data or KPIs and metrics are. Otherwise, how do we build the CRM to drive your processes that then measure, where you can measure the data in a meaningful way? So I like the way you position it, and it's very congruent with what we're hearing too. And then, of course, we'll talk more about the sort of that slow and steady growth, often winning the race versus like just trying to grow as fast as possible and then just fix things as they break, which sounds really painful. So, Ali, as organizations grow, where do you most often see alignment start to break down between leadership, operations, and execution?
I really like your framing in the rules of threes and tens, and that 30s is, sort of I think growth often comes in peaks and valleys, and in peaks and plateaus and points of inflection. And when you're growing really fast, that's one of the amazing things about franchising is as you're bringing more people into the network, you have this opportunity to scale a brand really fast in a way that where scale is different than growth. It's exponential. Um, and so when you look at those points of challenge is that you're sort of almost as soon as you put a process in place, you outgrow it. And so staying ahead of that cycle of thinking through the forward through where are we going to be in 2 or 3 years, which can be a really hard thing to do when you're just looking at surviving till tomorrow. And
Right.
what do we need to do to
Absolutely.
get tomorrow? And, and so finding that balance, I think where I see organizations really build strength through the challenging periods of growth are when there's a strong focus on mission and purpose. And because we all know where we're going and where we're heading, when you have a mission and purpose that you can communicate and rally around, and that gives you the framework and the guideposts, so that if you know what your mission is and you can identify some strategies that you're going to get there, you can use those as foundational concepts to build alignment
Right.
and
Yeah.
move in the right direction.
Yes. Yeah.
Move in the
And
same direction.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think when you, again, going back to what you said at the beginning, which is if you can combine that sort of, again, the communication and whatever that goes with that mission and vision with the sort of, you talked about unit level economics, and really, I think when you say that, you're saying it as a representation of how do we measure success, as we scale. And because, for everybody, again, for the founder or the CEO or the COO, they know the numbers like the backs of their hands. But if the people, further downstream don't know how to measure success, it makes it really hard, because otherwise everybody just feels like they're on this, a hamster wheel kind of thing. So again, understanding, I like the way you position the combination of those two of, culture, mission, vision, and then how do we measure success as we're growing, knowing that those measurements are most likely going to evolve slightly, as we go from 10 units to 30 units to 100 units to 300 units, and then, eventually to 1,000 and more. And which then brings us to sort of your third thing of like, well, how do you balance growth with stability? So as your processes are breaking at each of these different stages, knowing as a leadership team that those things need to be fixed, and what the things are that are going to break, of course, gives you an unfair advantage of knowing that we know that this is going to break. So we have to just be aware that as soon as we get to that point, it's most likely going to break. And we're going to need to replace it or update it or whatever the case may be. So I really like the sort of the way you've grounded that as being, those are, ultimately those are the core things that you have to keep doing no matter where you are in your sort of growth or scale phase. So
I think one of the challenging things in there is that there's a little bit more art to it than science. When you've been in franchising and you've had the opportunity to experience growth and you see how different brands do things, there are patterns that emerge and learnings that you can pull forward that can be really helpful. But
yeah.
there is some art to it in art. And it's not pure science. If it was pure science, we'd all have a formula and our crystal balls would all be perfect. And every franchise that ever launched would be, on the franchise 500 lists and winning all the awards and crossing that magic 100-unit threshold and royalty self-sustainability. So there is an art. It's not perfectly science, but there are also some frameworks that help you guide that art a little bit to the science. And so that's where, when you're looking at breaking your process and going through, if you wait for everything to be perfect or to have everything that you want, you're not going to grow either. So finding that right balance of how do we put the foundations in place that we know what are the most important for things for us to get right and to really stick and be committed to, and what are the things that we can evolve and fix and bring. And so there's, in my opinion and in my experience, it's a little bit of both. And if you're too rigid, you'll never reach the full opportunity that you have in front of you. But if you run too fast, you can stall because you get stuck in the problems. And so taking the magic is somewhere in the middle there.
Absolutely. So, and then Ali, as you think about, so, one of the things that we also hear a lot is, so essentially what you're talking about is when you're combining art and science and, culture and unit level economics, et cetera, you're touching on something else, which is mindset, right? So like, what do you see are the mindsets of founders of emerging brands that eventually do get past that magic, sort of 100-unit mark? Like, what is the mindset that they have that the ones that don't, what is the difference? What is their mindset?
Such a good question. I'd love to bottle the mindset of some of these really successful entrepreneurs. I think, there's a lot of conversation around a growth mindset and not necessarily a universal definition, but I think that's a really good starting point to say, we have a growth mindset. We're willing to take a step forward and to really say, and to take some of those risks where even if it's not perfect, you have a vision, you have a plan, and you believe in what you're doing and you're going forward. I think that's a big piece. I think a really important part of growth mindset is just curiosity and learning and being open to, especially in franchising, it's a very open community. I learned a lot of what allowed me to be successful to this point from talking to other people in the industry. And so if you have that opportunity and the piece of growth mindset where you're curious and you want to learn, but you're also really dedicated to what you're doing, I think those are two really key mindset pieces and a real focus on tying it all back to the mission and the values of your organization.
Right.
And in particular, when you're starting to build a brand and, in franchising, we're building brands and we're building communities. And so that shared mindset of who are you going to invite into your brand, into the future of this thing that you've built? And how do you know that you all want to move in the right direction and that it's going to be someone who's going to support your mission and your vision and work in alignment with your values. And those, the numbers drive the business metrics, but are we aligned and going the same forward? And so I think especially when I've worked with new franchisors, there's the basics of what you want to do to establish, is franchising right for you? Or do the economics work? Do you have the foundation? Can you make the investment? Do you have the team? What's your royalty going to be? It's regulated. We need an FDD. We need a franchise agreement, right? There's this checklist of, okay, if you're going to be a franchisor, you need your ops manual, you need your FDD, you need this. I think accompanying that, one of the things that we work really hard on in the very early stages of laying that foundation is to say, when you're the founder of a business, your values and your vision is ingrained in everything you do every day, and you're touching it in most cases every day. So looking at that early stage of when you're setting your foundation, not just what is my royalty rate, but taking that founder, the essence of what the business is that is infused just in the daily operations, and building that into your franchise planning, your franchise framework. When you're bringing people in, what is the common language and common understanding that we can have? So one of the early things that we do when we're looking at franchising a concept is to build out, the brand guides, the basic stuff. Like we're using the same logo, but also taking the moment to revisit and say, what is our mission, vision, purpose, and values? And really being sure that we can articulate what are the values. And so I can use the example of a company that's recently started franchising called Green in the Grain, based here in Minneapolis with us. And one of the early things we did, quite a bit of branding exercise, but also really taking the time to boil down into the essence of what are Green in the Grain's values, and then building that into the franchise program, into the questions we're asking franchise candidates about what their goals are for becoming a part of the franchisee, building it into some of the leadership team conversations to say, this is Green in the Grain and this is what we stand for. And there are things that you just experienced and absorbed because it is what the brand is when you have a founder running it. But as you expand and you scale, and there's more and more people coming in, having that common language of being able to say what you stand for, and build that into just the fundamentals of, in subtle ways and in less subtle ways, like what is our shared understanding? What is our shared communication? So that's a piece of that foundation building.
Yeah, no, that makes, I mean, it seems so simple, right? That's all you have to do. But I suppose so why do you think some brands don't get that right? Like what is distracting them from getting those basics right?
That's such a good question. I think some of it is you take it. I like to believe everybody comes in with good intentions, and some of it is in some ways it's so basic, and it's something that when your culture is ingrained in who you are, you're not necessarily thinking about, how do I take this and translate it into something that goes further, or you're caught up in the day-to-day of, where's the next sale? Do I have my marketing materials? Is my FDD filed? There's all sorts of pieces of the checklist of things you need to do to run your business every day. That sometimes the basics can fall behind.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned something just in passing a couple of minutes ago, which was the royalty self-sufficiency, which of course is such an important number. Do you think that's somehow part of this? Where these brands that sort of hit these ceilings of complexity, or where they are moving away from the basics, is because they're trying to get this to royalty self-sufficiency number sort of at all costs? Is that potentially part of it? Or at least one example?
Definitely think there's an interrelation between the economics of reality of what you're trying to achieve and the ceilings and challenges that you face, and those decisions that you make early on in your royalty structure, your initial franchise fee, your franchise development approach. Is it more organic? Are you doing it? How is your business going to get the resources it needs to invest in the future? And have you lined those things up? So, royalty self-sufficiency, I think, is a really important concept in that. And for those who, don't know what that means, it basically means that you can cover the core operating expenses of your business as a franchisor from royalty alone, and not necessarily from the initial franchise fees. And a lot of franchise organizations, they do, a key part of the initial way that you're investing into the system is through that collection of those initial franchise fees.
Yeah.
That can be a lot harder if you are taking a broker strategy, where a lot of that initial franchise fee cash flow doesn't come back into the business. So that can put so that franchise strategy that you take at the outset, I'm not sure if you're a new founder and you're a new franchising, that you always know that those decisions are intentional in what the outcomes way. 'Cause there's an element of you don't know until you get into it.
Right.
I think that balance of where do you hit your tipping point is going to be different for every concept. So that's
Again, it's we're I mean, clearly we understand that it's not easy, right? Even though there are certain things that are simple. I think sort of part of what you're saying is like, life gets in the way, and it's hard to keep up with all the moving parts, and which is why getting the right advice from people who've seen success before is often one of the things I've heard so much from franchise brands that have been successful. They'll often share with us that the reason for that is because they really sought advice, and they took that advice early on, and that helped them to sort of break through that 100-unit mark so much more successfully. And of course, knowing that, again, that things are going to break. Once they get past 100, things are going to break again at least once or twice before they get to 300. So, Ali, just sort of coming back to your sort of, I guess, experience, you've worked across legal, operational, and sort of growth leadership roles. How has that shaped the way you think about scaling organizations?
It's played a lot in shaping the scaling question. I think one of the things that has been really, in retrospect, helpful to me in building Kaleidoscope today and in building where I am today is that because my introduction to franchising was from a legal perspective, I got to see in the background not only work with brands in every different stage of development, from setting up their first FDD to selling their first franchise to, scaled global operations and looking at international expansion. And so seeing all of those different stages of development, and also, people usually bring their lawyers some of the harder questions. If they're easy, you solve them in-house. And so I think my introduction to franchising, in the way that breadth across sectors, the breadth across maturity of systems, and in just tackling some of the hard questions over and over again, that emerges in different patterns. And that was something that I was able to then take and move as I moved into business roles and really driving development, and then driving, overall international operations, and now working with founders on setting their strategy and putting those pieces in place to go. Is that when you've experienced a little bit what some of the challenges are, I think it gives the opportunity to look and say, like, look, this really matters early on. This other thing, like, it matters, but you can fix it. You can deal with it later. You're not at the phase yet where this is the critical thing. But these are the things that if we don't get them right the first time and we're not focused on them, you can recover from most things. But there are some things, like which franchisees you bring into your business from the start, how you set up your economics for your own success as a franchisor, for your franchisees' success, how you think about your supply chain. Like, there are some fundamental decisions early on that have a little bit of an outsized influence on whether you will be able to recover and move past some of those challenge points. And so I think that's where just having this really broad mix of experience in really different roles has let me see a lot of things that happen, and you can take some of those puzzle pieces and those patterns and then discern and say, look, we're not at the phase yet where we need to worry about this. Yes, it's great advice. There's so much great advice out there. That's great advice, but we need to solve problems 1, 2, and 3, and we need to focus on opportunities 1, 2, and 3 before we get to that next thing.
Yeah. So Ali, I know we've already touched on this multiple times already, but maybe just to ask the question more specifically to see if there's anything else that you might think of. So what we're talking about here is a lot of brands focus heavily on expansion, right? So how should leaders balance growth with operational discipline and governance?
Such a good question. I think I'm hesitating a little bit because I want to say something that's probably just a little too strong and maybe a little controversial. But I'm going to go ahead. And I think it comes back to that question of unit economics. And so when I think about growth at all costs, you can sell your way to 100 units, to 200 units, to 300 units through optimism and great sales process. And what you can't as easily sell your way past is, are your franchisees profitable? Does your business model work? Does it work at scale? And so when you're looking at that balance, again, that fundamentally, do your unit level economics work? And if your unit level economics are in a great place, then you have all of the options ahead of you on what that looks like and how fast you grow and what you put in there. And, the sky's the limit, and run for it. If those unit economics or your own economics as a franchisor and your, the requirements that you have, whether that's loans or capital or investor expectations or, those economic pieces, I think I didn't go too controversial there, but I think that
No,
economic piece is really the key.
yeah, but which again, it seems so simple, right? So again, even, and I'm guessing, most leaders who are listening to this have probably heard this before more than once. So if nothing else, I think it's a good reminder that maybe we need to slow down in certain areas to make sure that our unit level economics, you know, are are right before we get too far ahead. Because I think, to your point, trying to then you unravel something when you get to 400 units, and you suddenly have, 100 or more franchisees that are very unhappy with the current situation. That of course means you're probably not going to sell another unit until that changes, and it's a lot more difficult at that scale than it is to do that when you're at 20 or 30 units.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and if I can use an example on sort of the foundation and the decisions, it's easy to give kind of the big picture overviews and they say, well, how do you actually do that? Like, what is the difference? And so,
Mm,
what's one, just to use as an example, one common thing is, you know, most people who are beginning their franchise journey and most franchisors, they've experienced success.
mhm,
And you have that success. When you start to franchise or you move into a new market, and quite frankly, whether you're franchising or not, if you're just growing into a new market, you
mhm,
look at something as simple as your marketing materials and your approach of kind of introducing your brand into a new market. And when you've had operations in your home market, you've had maybe a decade of consumer awareness being built, of that introduction of who you are and what you stand for. You're benefiting from that brand recognition in your
mhm,
home market. So when you
yep,
pick that up, and we see this a lot in international, but it applies in domestic,
mhm,
and just anytime you're going into a new market, is that you'll use those marketing materials. You say, oh, well, we have our new campaign for the summer. And so we're just going to send it to all our locations without necessarily thinking through the nuance of, well, over in our new market here, nobody knows who we are yet. And
mhm,
so if we've started, if the learning curve of who we are and what we are, like maybe you overcome that, but
mhm,
also to say, okay, well, what do we, when we were first back in the day introducing who we were to the marketplace, how did we educate customers and consumers about, assuming it's a consumer business, about who we are and what we do and how we're different?
mm,
And so there's a little bit of that nuance in, localization, but also just in introducing yourself, that if you're just using the exact same strategy and the exact same marketing materials, yes, they're successful in your core business. But maybe there's a nuance that you missed in saying we should tell people a little bit more about who we are
mm.
so that they can then join our learning curve of and be as excited as we are about what we're offering out to the
Yeah.
public. So
Yeah, which of course is again, it's as you, I mean, I think you um very well said that this happens in all kinds of businesses, but it's because it's a human thing, right? When you've been doing something for 10 years and you finally moved on to something that's a little more successful, it's hard to then go back to what you did in year 1 and 2 when you go to a new market. But that's what you need to do, because people don't yet know or trust you as a brand. So
and
yeah,
And
makes a lot of
another, like,
sense.
more specific, I spent a lot of my career in fitness and some of that in global. And so as US consumers, we went to gym, we had gym, we had the presidential challenge. We know what a pull-up is. We know what a sit-up is. We're involved in sports, like that, like a basic core education. American consumers are they're that's just part of the daily life. But
Right.
when you go into some more emerging markets where there's, maybe instead of having 20-25% of the population who are members of gyms, you have less than 1% of the population who has a
Hmm.
membership to a gym.
Hmm.
And so one of my favorite stories in the kind of looking at the international is that at someone who went into a gym in an emerging market and it had, the modern equipment, and someone had taken a weight plate and set it on the floor and was using it as basically like a podium while doing and like using a bar and smoking a cigarette while trying to do some exercise, and just like very clearly, had not had an introduction to what is this equipment? How do I conduct an effective workout? And
Hmm.
so, if you've outgrown maybe the sort of like, here's your basic 8 workout of if you're, so your introduction to the gym, we come in, here's eight things you can do. That was
Hmm.
something that maybe the American consumer has moved past a little bit. But
Sure.
in an emerging market, you might need to educate around, here's a workout routine and why we do it and how we do it. And here's how you use some of these weights and
Right.
different things.
And I think in that example, which is a really good one, I'm guessing you're talking about Snap there, but is, you know, you forget how long that education can take if it's something that never existed for that, you know, population before. I mean, that education can take a very, very long time.
It can, and it also can happen quickly, but it's not going to you might not have the same uptake in, your membership retention when
Yeah.
people aren't seeing results, and they're not seeing results because they didn't come in with the same fundamental knowledge. And so
Right.
that,
Yeah.
understanding your process and your marketing and kind of putting those
Yeah.
putting those together. It's
Yeah.
not,
Right.
again,
Which
more
again,
art than science.
yeah. Well, but again, like one of the things we say a lot around here is, you're either winning or learning.
Mm, I
And
love that.
what I like about that example is that, let's just say you take your fitness brand from the US or North America to an emerging market in, Europe or wherever else. When you see that uptake is slow and that people don't really know what all this equipment is about, that then tells you to, when you're going to be looking to another market, you want to look for a market where people are already familiar with equipment, so that the uptake isn't going to take as long. So you at least you're learning something that allows you to expand in a market that maybe you weren't initially looking at.
Yeah, potentially. Or
Yeah.
incorporating that education or understanding that, there's a strong desire for people to learn, but they just don't you don't you the approach is different.
Yes.
And I think that's a pretty extreme example that
Sure.
shows in every, cooking at altitude, if you're a food brand, like
Hmm.
there are just things that come in expansion where you've defined a very successful way. You run a really successful business in
Hmm.
the hopefully, if you're going to get into franchising, that should be the foundational question.
Hmm.
And but then revisiting some of those learnings from over time and incorporating that into just a thoughtful growth plan.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a lot of that's a lot. I really, because we don't talk that much about international expansion, but I have a lot of thoughts, because I've lived in 5 other countries before moving to the US, and of course now my mind is thinking about all kinds of connections and opportunities. But let's bring it back. So Ali, from your perspective, what role does leadership development play in long-term franchise and business performance?
I mean, a huge role. I think that's when you look at what brands that are successful in the marketplace and franchisees that are successful in the marketplace and people that, often you see really great leaders joining those brands. And so that leadership development, as your business is growing, you have these amazing opportunities to develop existing team members and give them new opportunities. You have amazing opportunities to bring new insights and new people into an organization. The needs change so fast that
Hmm.
leadership development of at every level of the organization and in sort of every way, bringing the right people, bringing really great, talented people who have experience to offer makes such a transformational difference in your journey, in my opinion.
Yes, yeah. And it seems to be, I mean, the reason I asked that question is because there seems to be one of the constants that so when a brand hits a ceiling at whether it's 10 units or 30 units or 100 units or 300 units, the first thing that seems to break is where they don't have necessarily the right people to support the existing infrastructure. And I think, I mean, and you just touched on it with when you said that you often already have people within the brand that you can promote and bring them into a new role that is critical to you scaling to that next level. But in many cases, you need to add an additional role that doesn't yet exist, because it wasn't needed to get from 10 to 30, but it's absolutely needed to get from 30 to 100 or from 100 to 300. And that was the reason I asked that question. As I was thinking about it, the more leadership sort of training that you provide as you go, you have to believe that the easier it's going to be to scale, because one of the main roles of leadership is not just fran dev. It's in my mind, it's supporting franchisees. So,
Mhm.
do you have the right people and leaders, and are they properly trained to support franchisees to be successful? Which, from all the things that you've said so far, it seems to be something that you are passionate about.
I am. I'm really passionate about that. And that's one of the things I love the most. I think it's what's kept me in franchising is that just the opportunities and the domino of opportunities that go when you're growing a brand and you're building from, the bring it franchisees who come in and become business owners, the teams that they hire, the internal opportunities. When you hire someone as an intern and then they grow and they're, director and VP of of your business or of another business, those
Mm-hmm.
stories of the opportunities that come from delivering a great product, building a brand, I think we're all interested in opportunities and being, learning and providing value and earning value.
Yeah, which actually probably comes back to what you were saying at the very beginning, which is around sort of culture and mindset. And one of the things we hear more and more about now, even as we start talking about within the franchise space, of course, as in every other industry, we're talking about how AI is going to impact franchising or a particular brand. And it seems to be that so there's a what you see in a lot of successful cultures is this whether it's a core value or a mindset of always being making yourself sort of irreplaceable. And I think what AI is doing is just shining a light on the parts of your current role that maybe AI could do and that you don't even really like to do. So again, just continuously elevating yourself, but again, to do that you need to be in the right culture and have the right mindset to do that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. We're at such a pivotal moment where there's so much conversation around AI and people. And I think in kind of the businesses that I'm working with and we're thinking about and looking at kind of how technology has transformed business up to this point and what lessons could we learn to move forward and how do we think about this and approaching with curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
I think as there are in my view, I think if you're a growing and an emerging franchisor, you're at a great moment to really think about how your approach to AI will impact your organization, and that could be positive or negative. I think
Mm-hmm.
so many franchise organizations are customer facing the word that, they're just very human centric, especially when you're
Sure.
looking at service things. Like the
Mm-hmm.
human element doesn't have to be lost, but how do we think about where we bring, whether it's AI or other technology, to let people do what people do best,
Mm-hmm.
and take off the plate. And so thinking about AI and technology as a support for the people that are already in the business, I think is a really fun and interesting way. And I think there are plenty of opportunities there. And when you're with a growing business, the fun thing is that you're always looking to, there's always more you can do. And so if you can find ways to be more efficient or deliver something, but really do that in a way where you are preserving that, the customer service, the human element,
Yes.
that finding that right balance and keeping that focus on how do we enable the people within our organization to do what they do best, even better.
Yeah. There are a lot of experts right now talking about the fact that that's really who we are at our core. That what we're good at as
Mm.
humans is very different to how we've been educated for the last 200 years. Primarily around sort of the industrial revolution. We've been trained at school and then in our jobs to be machines, right? To do the same thing
Mm.
over and over again, which is essentially like a machine. But now we've realized that the machines can actually do so many of those things better than we can.
Mm.
So what can we do as humans to do the things that only humans can do? But anyway, that's a different conversation for a different day. But again, if that's helpful to anyone as they're thinking about, well, just delegate the things that are really better done by a machine, which is, even though that's what we've been trained through our society for a long, long time to sort of how to behave, that's really not where the opportunity is going forward, because the machines and the automation and the AI are probably going to do those things better than we can.
Yeah, there's definitely something there. But I think it also goes with the technology adoption. There are, we've been adopting technology now for several decades and
Hmm.
all of human history in many ways.
Absolutely.
And there are lessons that we can learn going forward. And I think you know, we get AI is exciting. I love it. I'm exploring all the different models. We're using it in different ways. But I think when you're looking at running a company and growing a franchise organization, to
Hmm.
make sure that we're grounding the conversation in going all the way back to that, what are our goals, and what are the business outcomes that we're looking for, and letting
Mhm.
AI help us solve the problems we've already identified, rather than, say, well, we have to have AI, so we're gonna here's the AI solution.
Mm.
If it's not
Absolutely.
grounded in the problem that you're solving, then I think it's not gonna
Absolutely.
serve you well.
That's really good advice. So, Ellie, as we start wrapping up here, so let's maybe talk for about systems for a second. So, how do you help? Essentially, at Kaleidoscope, your role now is around advising brands as they scale. Correct. So how do you help growing brands create systems at scale without losing the agility, culture, and decision making speed?
It's really that is the magic and the core of why I founded Kaleidoscope, and what I love to do every day is that, as we talked about before, there's some science, but there's also some art. And so what we've developed at Kaleidoscope are a couple pathways to work as a strategic advisor with brands, where it's really diving in to really understand, we know franchising. We know some of the patterns, and we're always learning. There's always something new you can take. And we know franchising. When we dive in and really understand and work with deeply in a long-term partnership with a brand, it's combining those two pieces with a customized plan to say, we really understand these patterns in franchising. We really understand who you are as a brand. We're going to partner in a long-term view to an operating playbook and an evolutionary framework for your business that is
Mm.
tailored and customized to where you are in this moment, warts and non-warts.
Yeah, that has to be incredibly valuable to whoever you work with, because again, even with all the great advice that exists in the franchise space, there's no playbook that you know that tells you exactly what to do at every stage of growth and scale.
I think that's what's fun about franchising. That's what's interesting, is that each business, as much as franchising really is about developing systems and process, and there's sort of you hear kind of, well, it's cut and paste and repeat the process. And there's a lot of that, and there are a lot of lessons and
Hmm.
things that you can, but if you just cut and paste and you don't add that overlay of who you are and what's happening in the marketplace and what phase are you in the business, those are really important. Those are really helpful and can distinguish what the next right step is for your organization. So something I'm really passionate about and really love to do is to meet a company where they are, meet a franchise brand where they are, and develop that plan as a thought partner for how do we take this to the next level, and using that track record and those experiences to do that.
Mm, I love that. I mean, and that's essentially where we started, right? Which so, and you're coming at that, again, starting with that sort of cultural, sort of vision, mission type starting point, which is such a that is the one constant, that you can always go back to as everything else continues to evolve, which is what you want to happen if you want to grow, right? But that constant of knowing who you are, what the mission is, and then how do you bring people along on the journey. I mean, I like the way you wrapped that up of where we started and kind of where we're ending. So, Ali, I have one last question because I know we could chat for hours. So, looking ahead, how do you see franchise growth and operational leadership evolving as organizations become more technology driven and more data focused?
I'll just polish my crystal ball and say, I think again, it goes back to we're at a transformational moment, but also there are some universal truths that we can learn from history. And so I think as we move forward with our organizations and we're adopting new technology, that the opportunity is to mesh your core, the magic that you have in your brand, and support that with your technology.
I really like that. That's good, great advice. Thank you so much. Ellie, thanks so much for being here today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I know we'll have many more. Thank you.